Hello, this is Mahnaz Behroozi. I'm a PhD student at NC State University. Our mission from our series of studies is to make technical interviews more inclusive. Essentially, our main question is, are we assessing the things that we want to be assessing? Today, I want to talk about our paper, Does Stress Impact Technical Interview Performance? This work is a joint work between NC State University and Microsoft. This paper is part of a broader research agenda. In our previous studies, we did narrative analysis on online communities such as Hacker News and Glassdoor about software engineers' hiring process experience. These studies were basically a ground for building theoretical foundation for conducting the current study, which is a lab study on candidates as they perform a task. Before we talk about technical interviews, let's talk about this psychology experiment, tier social stress test, or TSST. In this procedure, first participants are taken into a room to give a presentation to judges, framed as job interview. Then participants are given a mental arithmetic component task. For example, count backwards from 10 to 22 in steps of 13. And if they make a mistake, they have to start over or take some other kinds of penalties. It reminds me of something. Does it sound familiar to you as well? This is what TSST assesses. The TSST is the human experimental gold standard for evaluating the neurobiology of acute stress. Now let's have a look at what is a technical whiteboard interview. A whiteboard interview is a common form of interviewing a software engineer in which interviewers ask candidates to solve a coding problem on a whiteboard. While writing the code, candidates have to think aloud in order to let interviewers see their thought process. Bingo! I told you I saw TSST somewhere. So are technical interviews instantiations of the TSST? Well, we saw that in TSST, participants are taken into a room to give a presentation to judges, framed as a job interview. So as in the technical interviews, candidates are taken into a room to be interviewed by software engineers or a hiring manager. In TSST, participants are given a mental arithmetic component task. As we said, as an example, count backwards from 10 to 22 in steps of 13. And in technical interviews, participants are given a puzzle, a brain teaser, or an algorithm problem. For example, one example of the algorithm problems, which is also on lead code, is invert a binary tree. And in TSST, if candidates make a mistake, they have to start over or take some sort of penalty. In technical interviews, if candidates perform poorly, the loop of the interview will end and they will no longer be considered for the rest of the hiring process. From our previous narrative analysis studies on Hacker News and Glassdoor, we also found that one of the main concerns of technical interview candidates about whiteboard interviews is the stress induced by thinking aloud and being watched by interviewers. This also confirms why we see similarities between TSST and technical interviews. So up to here, we saw that whiteboard interviews have TSST issues. They're like TSST. And we also have this clue that many candidates wrote about their difficulty with being watched and being asked to think aloud, and they reflected these concerns on online communities such as Hacker News and Glassdoor. So the question is, what is one simple intervention that we can consider to address the TSST issue in whiteboard interviews? Well, probably eliminating the public performance, right? The next question will be, what can we learn from the effects of that intervention? What is the effects that we can see from the interventions, and what conclusion we can take from that sort of effect? Well, if our intervention results in dramatic performance changes, especially for certain groups of candidates such as women, minorities, people with imposter syndrome, or performance anxiety, it could suggest that current form of technical interviews is eliminating certain groups of people, and possibly it is hurting diversity. So basically, we need an answer to this question. Do candidates perform differently in private interviews? So basically, our intervention will be creating an interview in which candidates can perform privately rather than being watched or being asked to think aloud. So by our proposed intervention, we are about to investigate that if traditional whiteboard interviews are a procedure for identifying candidates who best handle and migrate stress solely caused by being examined by an interviewer or performance anxiety, rather than assessing problem-solving ability and coding competency. Let's see how we conducted our study. We recruited 48 students. These students were either already interviewing or close to interviewing for software engineering positions. We had 2 interview settings for our experiment: public setting and private setting. Public setting was like traditional interview, whiteboard interviews, which has a TSST issue, where participants solve a task in presence of an interviewer or a panel of interviewers. And they are also asked to think aloud while they're writing their code on the whiteboard. In the private setting, participants solve the problem in isolation without interviewers and without mandating them to think aloud. 26 participants performed in the public setting in our experiment, and 22 of them performed in a private setting. In each interview setting, we asked participants to wear eye-tracking glasses and solve a medium-level difficulty lead code question. So, for example, the question that we asked was right here. Given a string, find the length of the longest substring without repeating characters. The selected coding problem was among the frequently asked questions from well-known companies. Here you can see the number of times this question had been asked since last 6 months, and its breakdown by companies, which has been reported by LeetCode. So for example, you can see that Amazon asked this question for 37 times in the last 6 months. So it's quite a frequent question to be asked. From these experiments, we collected data from different channels: eye tracking data, post-task survey, and NASA TLX questionnaire. And we also assessed candidate solutions against 3 test cases. With the help of the eye tracking data, we measured cognitive load through proxy measures of fixation duration and pupil dilation. And also we measured stress with the use of saccade velocity from the eye movement. We triangulated eye tracking measurements with data from NASA TLX measures of effort, frustration, stress, mental demand, temporal demand, physical demand, and performance with the scales from 1 to 21. And we also gave the candidates subjective questionnaires to reflect their experience with the task. And finally, we assessed candidate solution against 3 main test cases for the coding problem. And the results from this study is as follows. Results from analysis of data from different channels showed that candidates experience higher cognitive load and stress in the traditional public setting. Eye tracking data showed candidates having significantly longer fixation durations, larger pupil dilation, and lower saccade velocity, which all of these are confirmed in psychology research that they are good representative, reliable representatives of experiencing stress and cognitive load. And also based on replays of video recordings, we saw that we observe a few observations that help explain some of participants' behaviors. Participants had higher stability of eye movement, where problem solving in the private setting versus public setting. Or to put it another way, participants in the public setting had a more scattered and erratic set of eye movements. So they had more dispersion in their scan path, as you may see in the blue lines. You can see this is pretty scattered and unorganized. Whereas in the public setting, private setting, the eye movement were more focused and in control, and you can see that it is much more organized compared to the public setting. We also triangulated eye tracking data analysis with analysis of candidates' responses to questionnaires, subjective questionnaires and surveys. Through participant observations and self-reporting, participants had different interview experience in the two settings, although the coding problem and task that we gave them was the same. In the public setting, participants reflected being stressed from being watched. For example, some of the codes that you may see is, for example, constantly supervised, made me nervous, self-conscious about the whole process, think and talk and do code at the same time. This is basically the complaints that the candidates raised against the public setting. And in the private setting, on the other hand, they reflected that they were happy with the time and space to work alone. So some of the codes here was, did not feel rushed. I like having space and time to think about the problem. And NASA TLX also showed significantly higher stress and frustration in public setting compared to the private setting. Candidates in the public setting also obtained significantly lower scores compared to the private setting. About 61% of candidates in the public setting failed to pass all three test cases, while only 36 of the candidates failed to ace the task in the private setting. Another important finding, which confirms possible threat of traditional whiteboard interviews non-inclusiveness, was the high vulnerability of women and their failure in the public setting. None of the women aced the task in the public setting, while all of them aced it in the private setting. Yet men's performance did not seem to be much affected by the setting. Roughly 50% of them aced the task in each of the settings. From the things that we have learned from the results, our paper also suggests a set of interim guidelines to help resolve the TSST issue with the traditional whiteboard interviews. For example, we can reduce cognitive load by separating task completion from explanation. In this way, interviewers can still see candidates' thought process without breaking the thought process itself with mandating the candidates to have a concurrent thinking aloud while they're solving a coding problem. And second, we first need to be aware that there are different types of stress. If a position needs stress-tolerant people, it is important to see what kind of stress is prevalent in that certain job position. It is necessary to familiarize ourselves with the type of stress that a certain position needs. For example, is it necessary that the employee be social stress immune, or still the position can be handled by someone who has social anxiety, but they're perfect coders, and they're really qualified for such a position. And third, the idea of having standardized interview process may be tempting, but we should be aware that standardization may be at cost of diminishing inclusiveness. So it might be a good idea to give candidates a choice as to what works best for them, not to forcing all of them to perform publicly, or, for example, to diminish all the affordances with conducting an interview on a whiteboard. Thank you so much for your attention.